You ever hear about those old roadside motels that seem frozen in time? The kind with flickering neon signs peeling paint, and a vibe that makes you feel like you've stepped into a different decade? Yeah, I stayed at one of those. It was called the Hollow Haven, and it's the reason I don't trust cheap motels anymore. This was back in 2016. I was driving cross-country, moving from Chicago to Portland for a new job. I'd been on the road for about 12 hours when I saw the sign. Hollow Haven Motel, $30 a night, free Wi-Fi. It was late, I was exhausted, and my GPS had been glitching for miles, so I figured, why not? The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, and the office had this weird yellow light that made everything look sickly. The guy at the front desk was off. He had this blank stare, like he wasn't really looking at me, and his voice was flat, almost robotic. He handed me a key and said, "Room 12, checkouts at 10. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Musty carpet, a sagging bed, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. But it was clean, and at that point I didn't care, I just wanted to sleep. I was about to crash when I noticed something weird. The room had two doors, the one I came in through and another, smaller one near the bathroom. It was locked, and there was no keyhole, just a rusty handle. I figured it was a closet or something and didn't think much of it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse in the walls, but it got louder. I sat up, my heart pounding, and realized it was coming from the locked door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it at the door. The scratching stopped, and for a second, everything was quiet. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could make out the words. "Let me out." I froze. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, let me out." I stumbled out of bed and backed away from the door, my mind racing. Was someone trapped in there? Was this some kind of sick joke? I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to grab my stuff. The guy at the front desk was still there, staring at the same spot on the wall. I told him what happened, my voice shaking, but he didn't even blink. "Room 12, he said, like he was reading from a script. "Checkouts at 10. I demanded he open the door, but he just stared at me, his expression blank. Finally, I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the room but found nothing. The locked door? It was just a wall. No handle, no hinges, nothing. The cops thought I was crazy, and honestly, I started to wonder if I was. But before I left, I noticed something. The guy at the front desk was smiling. Not a friendly smile. A cold, knowing smile. I got in my car and drove until I found a 24-hour diner. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I looked up the Hollow Haven online. Turns out, it's been abandoned since the 80s. The owner went to prison for, well, let's just say he had a thing for locking people in small spaces. I don't know what I heard that night. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. All I know is, I'll never stay at a roadside motel again. I've stayed in a lot of hotels and motels over the years. Cheap roadside dives, luxury resorts, everything in between. But there's one place I'll never forget. It's called the Blackwood Lodge, and it's the reason I don't trust remote, off-the-grid accommodations anymore. This happened about 5 years ago. I was on a solo road trip through the Pacific Northwest, exploring the dense forests and winding mountain roads. I'd been driving for hours, and the sun was starting to set. My GPS had lost signal miles back, and I was starting to worry I'd have to sleep in my car. That's when I saw the sign. Blackwood Lodge. 5 miles ahead. Vacancy. The lodge was tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by towering evergreens that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. It looked like something out of a postcard. A rustic 2-story building with a wide porch and a chimney puffing out smoke. The kind of place you'd see in a travel magazine with the caption "Escape to Nature." I parked my car and walked up to the front desk. The lobby was cozy with a roaring fireplace, leather armchairs, and a deer head mounted on the wall. The man behind the desk introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, the owner. He was in his 60s with silver hair and a warm smile. He handed me a key and said, "Room 7, second floor. Dinner's at 7 sharp in the dining hall." The room was small but charming, with a wooden bed frame, a quilted blanket, and a window that looked out over the forest. I unpacked my things and decided to take a quick nap before dinner. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on the nightstand, a small leather-bound book with the words "guest log" embossed on the cover. I opened it, curious, and started flipping through the pages. It was filled with entries from previous guests, most of them praising the lodge's hospitality and scenic location. But as I got deeper into the journal, the tone changed. One entry read, "Something's not right here. I keep hearing noises outside my window, like someone's walking around the lodge at night. Mr. Blackwood says it's just the wind, but I don't believe him." Another, "I woke up last night and saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. When I turned on the light, it was gone. I'm leaving first thing in the morning." The most chilling entry was near the back. "Don't trust Mr. Blackwood, he's not what he seems. If you're reading this, get out while you still can." I closed the journal, my heart racing. Was this some kind of prank? A way to spook guests for fun? I tried to shake it off and headed downstairs for dinner. The dining hall was warm and inviting, with a long wooden table set for about a dozen people. But there were only 3 other guests. An elderly couple and a man in his 40s who introduced himself as Tom. Mr. Blackwood served us a hearty meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, and the conversation was pleasant enough, but I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. As I walked, I noticed something strange, a small fenced-off area behind the lodge. Inside were rows of wooden crosses like a makeshift graveyard. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to go back inside, but something caught my eye. A figure was standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the tree line. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could tell it was watching me. I hurried back to the lodge and locked myself in my room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard a faint knock. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I got out of bed and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door just enough to look out, but there was no one there. That's when I noticed the journal. It was lying on the floor outside my room, open to a blank page. Written in fresh ink were the words, "You shouldn't have come here." I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, clutching my phone and waiting for sunrise. The next morning, I packed my things and went downstairs to check out. Mr. Blackwood was behind the desk, his smile as warm as ever. "Did you enjoy your stay?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "It was interesting." He handed me my receipt and said, "We hope to see you again soon." I didn't respond. I just grabbed my keys and headed for the door. As I was leaving, I noticed something on the wall behind the desk. A framed photo of Mr. Blackwood standing in front of the lodge. The date on the photo was 1923. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. When I got home, I did some research on the Blackwood Lodge. Turns out it burned down in 1925, killing everyone inside, including the owner, Elias Blackwood. Back in 2007, I worked as a concierge at the Glass Tower, a luxury hotel in downtown São Paulo. It was a glamorous job, and I was proud of it. The hotel was a symbol of modernity, all sleek glass and steel, with a lobby that sparkled like a diamond. But one night, that glittering facade shattered. It started around 10 p.m. I was at the front desk when I heard what sounded like fireworks outside. Then the glass doors exploded. Men in black masks stormed in, armed with automatic weapons. They started shooting indiscriminately, their bullets shattering the crystal chandeliers and tearing through the marble floors. The lobby, once so beautiful, became a war zone. I ducked behind the desk, my heart pounding. The smell of gunpowder filled the air and the screams of guests echoed in my ears. The attackers were shouting in Portuguese, demanding to know where the foreign guests were staying. They were targeting Americans and Europeans, dragging them out of their rooms and executing them in the hallways. I managed to call the police, whispering our location into the phone. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I started guiding guests to safety through the staff corridors. We moved like shadows, staying silent as the gunmen roamed the halls. At one point, we hid in a storage closet, listening as the attackers set fires and threw grenades to flush people out. The explosions were deafening and the smoke made it hard to breathe. The worst moment came when one of the gunmen found us. He was high on something, his eyes wild, and he pointed his gun at a British couple hiding with me. I stepped forward, begging him to let them go. He laughed and said, "You're lucky you're not one of them." Then he walked away, leaving us trembling in the dark. The siege lasted for hours. When the police finally stormed the building, the gunmen fought to the death. The hotel was in ruins, its once pristine halls littered with broken glass and blood. I helped the survivors out, my hands shaking as I guided them past the bodies of people I'd known. The aftermath was a blur. I quit my job soon after, unable to set foot in the glass tower again. The nightmares started almost immediately. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of gunfire ringing in my ears. Even now, years later, I can't hear a loud noise without flinching. I've never told my family about that night, but ever since, I now have an irrational fear of slamming doors. Whether it's my kids in our house or out in public, one slam instantly teleports me back to that moment. I don't know how to explain why the sound of a slamming door sends me into a panic. Maybe, if I share this story, they'll understand. It's not anger they see in me, it's fear. Fear that never really goes away. My grandmother was a detective in the 1950s, back when women in law enforcement were rare. She worked in a small, dusty town in Arizona, where the desert stretched endlessly, and the heat made the air shimmer like a mirage. She passed away when I was young, but the stories about her have always stuck with me. This one in particular haunts me to this day. Back then, the town was a hot spot for smugglers and outlaws. The desert was a perfect hiding place for those trying to evade the law, and my grandmother was often on their trail. One case, though, was different. It involved a place called the Crimson Inn, a rundown motel on the edge of town that had a reputation for being a safe haven for criminals. The story began when a local shopkeeper was shot during a robbery. The suspect, a man named Jack "Red" Malone, was known for his violent temper and his knack for disappearing without a trace. My grandmother got a tip that Red had been spotted near the Crimson Inn, so she and her partner, a grizzled veteran named Tom, drove out to investigate. The inn was owned by an elderly couple, the Hargroves. They were sweet as pie, always smiling and offering coffee to anyone who stopped by. They claimed they hadn't seen Red, but my grandmother wasn't convinced. The place had a strange energy, like it was holding its breath. She and Tom searched the motel but found nothing. Still, something about the Hargroves didn't sit right with her. A few months later, another tip came in. This time, a witness claimed to have seen Red at the Crimson Inn again. My grandmother and Tom returned, but the Hargroves stuck to their story. No, they hadn't seen him. No, they didn't keep records of their guests. My grandmother pressed them, but they just smiled and shrugged. Frustrated, she and Tom left, but my grandmother couldn't shake the feeling that the Hargroves were hiding something. The final straw came when a third tip led them back to the Crimson Inn. This time, the witness claimed Red had been staying there for weeks, holed up in one of the rooms. When my grandmother confronted the Hargroves, they finally cracked. The old man admitted he'd seen Red, but claimed he didn't know who he was. My grandmother didn't buy it. She and Tom searched the motel again, but once more they came up empty. It wasn't until they got a lead from a captured smuggler that the truth came out. The man told them the Crimson Inn wasn't just a hideout, it was a trap. The Hargroves would lure criminals in, offering them shelter in exchange for a cut of their loot. But once the criminals were inside, they never left. My grandmother and Tom devised a plan. They sent an undercover officer to the inn, posing as a fugitive. The Hargroves took the bait, promising to help him disappear. But when the officer didn't return, my grandmother and Tom moved in. What they found was horrifying. Behind the motel, buried under the sand, was a hidden bunker. Inside, they found a makeshift morgue. The Hargroves had been killing their guests, embalming their bodies, and displaying them like macabre trophies. They claimed it was out of guilt. They only killed bad people after all. But my grandmother knew better. It was about control, about playing God in the middle of the desert. The Hargroves were arrested, but the damage was done. My grandmother never forgot the sight of that bunker, or the faces of the people who had trusted the wrong couple. She said it was a reminder that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it smiles and offers you coffee. Deep in the heart of Myanmar, nestled among the misty hills of Shan State, lies a place that few outsiders ever see. It's called the Jade Pagoda, a sprawling, opulent hotel that caters exclusively to foreign tourists. The government tightly controls who can visit, and those who are granted access are subjected to strict rules. You're always accompanied by a guide, and you're only allowed to visit a handful of carefully curated locations. The hotel itself is a fortress of luxury, but there's one floor that's strictly off-limits, the fourth floor. I learned about the Jade Pagoda from a friend who'd traveled to Myanmar as part of a cultural exchange program. She described it as a place of contradictions, a gleaming monument to wealth in a country where most people live in poverty. Intrigued, I decided to see it for myself. I arrived in Yangon in the spring of 2018. My guide, a soft-spoken man named Ko Min, met me at the airport and drove me to the hotel. The Jade Pagoda was even more impressive in person. Its lobby was a sea of marble and gold, with intricate carvings of dragons and lotus flowers adorning the walls. But there was something unsettling about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first day was uneventful. Ko Min took me to a nearby temple and a bustling market, but I couldn't stop thinking about the hotel's fourth floor. When I asked Ko Min about it, he hesitated before saying, "It's just storage. Nothing interesting." His tone made it clear that further questions weren't welcome. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hotel was eerily quiet and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do something reckless. I crept out of my room and took the elevator to the fourth floor. The doors opened to a dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with propaganda posters, images of soldiers and slogans praising the government. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet was worn thin. I walked slowly, my heart pounding, until I reached a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. Inside was a room filled with surveillance equipment. Monitors lined the walls, showing live feeds from every corner of the hotel. There were files on the desk filled with photos and notes about the guests. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. The hotel wasn't just a place for tourists. It was a trap. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I ducked behind a desk and held my breath. The door opened and 2 men walked in. They spoke in low voices, discussing something about the next target. I didn't understand everything they said, but one phrase stuck with me. "The fourth floor is where we break them." I waited until they left before bolting back to the elevator. The next morning, I told Ko Min I was feeling sick and needed to leave early. He didn't argue, just nodded and arranged for a car to take me to the airport. I never told anyone what I saw on the fourth floor. I didn't think they'd believe me. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the Jade Pagoda and wonder what happened to the other guests. Were they just tourists like me, or were they something else entirely? A few years ago, I decided to take a road trip from Seattle to Denver to visit my cousin Mia. She's not my real cousin, but we've been close since college. Mia had moved to Denver for work, and we had this tradition of spending a weekend together every year, exploring the city and catching up. To save money, I booked a cheap motel outside of Boise, Idaho for the night. It was called the Whispering Pines, and at $25 a night, it seemed like a steal. I didn't get to Boise until well after midnight. The motel was tucked away in the woods just off the highway. It looked quaint in the photos online, a row of cozy cabins surrounded by tall pine trees. But when I pulled into the parking lot, it felt off. The place was eerily quiet, and the only light came from a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy." The night clerk was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. She handed me a key and said, "You're the only guest tonight." I thought that was strange. It was a Friday, but I was too exhausted to care. I just wanted to shower and sleep. My cabin was at the far end of the property. It was small but clean, with a faint smell of pine cleaner. I unpacked my toiletries and noticed something odd. The trash can in the bathroom didn't have a liner. I dug through my bag and found a plastic grocery bag to use instead. As I was fitting it into the can, I noticed something scratched into the bottom of the metal liner. It was a single word: run. I stared at it for a long time, my heart racing. Was it a prank? A warning? I tried to brush it off, but the word stuck in my mind. I took a quick shower, trying to shake the unease, but when I stepped out, I noticed something else. The hairdryer in the cabinet had a piece of paper tucked underneath it. I unfolded it and froze. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Help me. Room 7. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. The clerk answered, sounding annoyed. I told her about the note and asked if she knew anything about it. She sighed and said, "Probably just some kids messing around. Happens all the time." I didn't believe her. I packed my bags and went back to the office, determined to check out. The clerk didn't seem surprised. She just handed me a receipt and said, "Have a safe trip." As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. I drove until I found a rest area and slept in my car. The next morning, I called the motel to report what I'd found. The woman who answered said she'd checked the room, but when she came back, she claimed there was no note and no writing in the trash can. I knew she was lying, but there was nothing I could do. I told Mia everything when I got to Denver. She listened quietly, then said, "You did the right thing. Even if it was just a prank, you trusted your instincts." Her words helped, but I still think about that night sometimes. I wonder if someone really was in trouble and if I could have done more. All I know is I'll never stay at the Whispering Pines again.